the reason that Reanimator last season with Entomb Reanimate is so good, and people are saying, well, how do you know what to fight against? It's like, well, if they have Daze Wasteland plus Threat or Entomb Reanimate, or they can just Barrowgoyf by itself and like think that, okay, Barrowgoyf as a pivot. And like there are all these pivots and you need all these different cards because the answers can't keep up with all these different axes that you're competing on. But then it's like, okay, well, if you put Grafdigger's Cage into play, it limits the Entomb Reanimate side of the package. But, you know, Entomb still like brought together, like Tamiyo can pick up something. So it's effectively a demonic tutor. Barrowgoyf plus, you know, additional sideboard threats of like whatever they might be playing is a whole nother axis because Barrowgoyf is also a card advantage engine by itself. So rather than going, okay, how do I beat this deck, try and boil the stuff down to the axes that they're competing on.
So you wanted to talk about this concept you've been pioneering called sideboard packages.
Yes. So something that I've been thinking about for a while, as there's like the clear power outliers to the format. We've talked about pillars of the format before. We've talked about like how if your deck isn't playing a power outlier or multiple power outliers, you're voluntarily handicapping yourself in the field because you can dilute pretty much every deck that does anything relevant in a tournament. You can boil it down to what its power outliers are as a baseline for what that deck can do up front, and then anything else it does on top of that is gravy, right? And after this ban of Entomb and Nadu, it's still clear what those power outliers are, and then it's clear what like the stuff that's like sort of brimming on that or like trying to like brim on that level are. And I think that when I am talking to a lot of people about sideboarding and sideboard mapping, and the conversations usually come down to like, hey, have you tried this for that? Have you tried this for this? And I'm thinking to myself, it's like, okay, well, if I do that, like sideboard space is limited. It's like bringing in something for one specific card when like the answers for things are not at the level of the things, right? So like, unless you're doing the power outliers and being proactive and compressing your game down to wanting to end the game before those cards can like take over. So like between like Tamiyo and the One Ring and stuff like that, where the stuff that happens like around it is irrelevant. Like that's the thing that is relevant, and you're competing on that axis until you're not. And that's where I'm thinking of this new idea for sideboard packaging of the cards that can deal with the axis of cards that matter rather than individual cards that matter. And there are some aspects of that encompass only one card, but that's not what I'm arguing for. What I'm saying is there are some cards or there are some strategies that have axes that they can compete on, right? So the basest example that I can offer for this, because it's where I originally got the idea from when I was learning about this like theory, is let's say you were playing against old ad nauseum tendrils, right? And I always go back to these things because when I was in my youth and I was learning all these, you know, game theory applications, I was like, these are the things that I learned them upon. But back in old ad nauseum tendrils days, there were three main axes that they had, unless they were adding some unusual pivot. But stock had three main axes. They could kill you via ad nauseum tendrils, right? Like storm through an ad nauseum. They could tutor chain, which is they make a shit ton of mana and then they go infernal tutor into an infernal tutor into kill you, or they could past in flames, right? So there are three axes that they could beat you on. Was they could ad nauseum you, they could tutor chain you, or they could past in flames you. And so when you were thinking, okay, what are the sideboard cards that I want? You're thinking at the metagame at large of like what you're looking to beat. But when you're thinking about a card, I'm not thinking what is a card that beats Past in Flames? What is a card that beats Ad Nauseam Tendrils? I'm thinking, what is a card that helps with whatever matchups I'm looking at and also may cut off one of those axes that they have? Because once you can have something that can stop a whole axis that they're competing on, then you can use your cantrips or your other cards to compete on the other axes, right? So if you think about like how we've talked about like burdening and unburdening your cards, if you have a plan or a bullet in your board that can shut off an axis rather than a card, you unburden your cantrips from having to sort of pick and choose between, well, I need this cantrip to find me this thing to fight over this thing. But if they still have three axes open that they could do to you, it's really hard to be like, well, I have this piece that can cut off one of them or cut off two of them, but like, what if they go for the other one? And so the more cards that you can allocate to your sideboard that can compete on the axes that you're hoping to stop or compete against, the more you unburden your cantrips to help solve your other problems. And then that can then consolidate your sideboard space and help you choose what cards you actually want to, put into your 75.
Black Friday is early this year. Use code BF25 for a 5% discount and free worldwide shipping on all orders over $300 from our online store, shop.3for1trading.com. The promotion starts on Wednesday, November 5th at 9 a.m. Central Time and ends on Wednesday, November 12th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. That's code BF25 for a 5% discount and free worldwide shipping on all orders over $300. Shop.3for1trading.com.
Does that all make sense?
It does. I mean, to me, the base takeaway here is basically determining ways to not lose to certain decks, and then attacking those angles.
Here's an example of modern day of where I have been thinking, and why I wanted to bring up this episode. There's one thing in particular of we talked about how I think the white-based decks or control decks are sort of contingent upon Prismatic Ending being relevant, and Prismatic Ending is good against a flipped Tamiyo, but is bad against One Ring unless you're, playing the shittiest mana base you've ever seen. And it's bad against stuff like Urza Saga because it only gets rid of one construct or the thing that they tutor for, assuming that thing doesn't kill you before you get to untap, because it's Prismatic Ending at sorcery speed. So Prismatic Ending, bad to mediocre against Urza Saga, bad to unplayable against One Ring, relevant against Tamiyo because there's only so many of those things that exist. And so between figuring out, okay, if these are the major pillars of the format and every one of these cards, so the reason that Urza Saga and Tamiyo and One Ring are so good is because they are individual axes. By themselves, they are a plan of action that you have to contend with. And that is so powerful for one card to be that thing. It's different from if you were looking at okay, Cephalid Breakfast has the combo, right? It's Cephalid Illusionist plus thing, or Show and Tell is Show and Tell plus thing. So it's multiple cards that create an axis, right? Like Show and Tell, for example, has Sneak Attack plus thing, or Show and Tell plus thing, or they can do stock up chains potentially to overwhelm. There are a couple of different things that they can do that can ostensibly win the game for them. But those are stock up into something is potentially good, but it's not reliable, right? You're not guaranteed to find it. And then you have a bunch of A plus Bs, or in which case there may be time they may open with it, but if there can also be times where a opponent could have multiple Show and Tells and no payoff, jam a Show and Tell, assuming that you have to fight over it, and then you could just say, okay, it resolves, and if they don't have it, they don't kill you, right? It's not a one card kill. Whereas One Ring comes into play, it's the only thing that's relevant until it's not. It will kill you. Tamiyo, it comes into play, it's the only thing that's relevant until it's not. It will kill you. Urza Saga, it will kill you. It doesn't need any other things. And so to have some amount of crossover for all these things where it's there isn't one card that covers all of it. But when I was thinking about, okay, well, Prismatic Ending only hits one of these three pillars that I need to contend with, I was what is something that might improve upon that where I can actually solve maybe two of them? And then I was I'm looking at cards that can do that. And then I'm looking at something like Engineered Explosives. And Engineered Explosives proactively on 1 can stop a Tamiyo. Proactively on 0 can stop Urza Saga. Proactively on 1 can stop whatever Urza Saga could get or prevent them from getting the thing that you care about. If you're thinking, I need this to care about Shuko because I can deal with the constructs in some other way. But it's also a thing where if they play a Tamiyo, if you try and fight over the Tamiyo, they can brainstorm and remove it or flip it. And if you try and, if they Prismatic Ending, they can counter it, but if there's an Engineered Explosive already on the table,
it's just an effect that is going to happen.
It's not foolproof, but it's an example of what is a card.
Wrath of the Skies is also lives in that zone too, which is also great against Tamiyo and great against Urza Saga, right?
Wrath of the Skies doesn't deal with the flipped Tamiyo, where an Engineered Explosive is on 1. If they have Brainstorm, that's the problem with Tamiyo. That's why it's inherently a broken card, is that it's impervious to removal with Brainstorm. But the fact that Engineered Explosives can hit a Tamiyo before or after it flips, assuming they don't have Brainstorm, and then not if it's already flipped, but then also can deal with either half of Urza Saga. So it's not foolproof. It's not great, right? But it does cover more ground than something that a singular Prismatic Ending can do. And then it also has relevant text against other go-wide strategies. So when you're thinking, okay, what is a card that I could play? If you're well, I need some number of Prismatic Endings for Tamiyo, instead of being okay, I'll play 3 Prismatic Ending or 4 Prismatic Ending, where it's or 2 Prismatic Ending, maybe you do a 1-1 split, or you cover a little bit more bases, and that's just sort of covering your axes, because then when you find that card, it's unburdening a bunch of other things.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that, because I'm always trying to find, whenever I'm doing a sideboard guide for myself, first off, I'm always trying to make sure that every card on my sideboard is actually being used. It's not just good. sometimes people will put cards in their sideboard that are really cool and have a great application to a matchup they'll never see, right? Like they're just like, I got to add this and I got to add this, and let me throw in a miser's this. And then a lot of times you find that when you go through a tournament, and I do this after every tournament, I look at my sideboard, I go, did I just completely miss on any of these cards? Like, did any of these cards never get used? Because you play in a 9-round tournament, you expect that every card in your sideboard is going to see the battlefield at least one, or at least be relevant, be sideboarded in, and so
the only time that is like, maybe if you're like, okay, well, this was planned for a matchup, and maybe you like got the pairings lottery where that matchup never really showed up for you, but it was around, like it was a played deck that was around.
I mean, I didn't play against Reanimator the entire time at North American Eternal Weekend, right?
Right, but it was there, right? So like, even though you never actually got to use your sideboard cards against it, if you like, it wasn't like a failed use of sideboard slots because it was present. You just got the matchup lottery.
And I did end up using. That's the beauty of the whole sideboard package plan, right? It's not like those sideboard cards sat in my sideboard and didn't get used. There were plenty of other decks that dealt with the graveyard, that like I did bring them in for. I'm just saying that's a perfect example of like a situation where like you could over-index for a matchup that it would seem relevant to do, right? And then just never see it. That totally does happen sometimes.
In times of financial uncertainty, how can you stay on track? Call someone who's invested in your success. Nick Ropp, your Edward Jones financial advisor and certified financial planner, is here to help you. He will work to build a complete picture of your financial life, including your unique goals and passions, so he can help you achieve what's most important to you. Call Nick Ropp at 314-377-9524 or email nicholas.ropp@edwardjones.com to schedule an appointment today. That's 314-377-9524 or email nicholas.roupp@edwardjones.com. Edward Jones member, SIPC.
To go back more into my like looking at your sideboard thing is like, not only do I want to have a plan for my sideboard, what comes in, what comes out, but I also try and make it abundantly clear in my head that like every card not only has its in and out, but like the ins and outs are easy to figure out, right? You make your 15 card sideboard, you do that, but then you have to look and see, did I actually use all 15 of my cards, or was there a card here that like I just thought would be a good sideboard card that I never brought in? Sometimes people bring in too much of one specific type of effect, and then they realize that like, oh, I would never bring in like 4 red blasts against a blue deck. It's just not what my deck is trying to do, or something like that. Where they're like, 3 is the most I would ever need, but I had 4 or 5. Like they're like, I have red blast and pyroblast. And, I really just made. And then every time they went up against a blue deck, they were like, well, it seems like too much. That's an odd example because it always feels good to bring in a red blast. But there are some cards that you might over-index on and think, oh, if I see this deck, I'm going to blow it out of the water. And you're like, it's not doing anything proactive. So like having 4 Fairy Macabres on my sideboard doesn't really do anything for me, then that might be a scenario where you think, okay, well, like if that's the case, do I really need that many in my sideboard? And then if I don't need that many in my sideboard, what do I need more of in my sideboard? What effect do I need more of, right? So I think for me, the way I approach it is I try to look and see what the problems of the problems that my deck has in facing, and then I'm not ever really trying to shore up good matchups. Like if I already know that I'm going to do well in that matchup, I can get got. It happens, but for the most part, if I feel like if I sit down against an opponent in a deck that I realize I know what's going on, I generally do okay because I know what is important and I know what to navigate. And I think that Legacy has been so spread out and has so many new players in the last 10 years that there aren't as many people doing like at this level of analysis, right? So like when I truly know my enemy and know myself, like I generally don't think that I have much of a problem in that matchup. But assuming that I have the right sideboard configurations and my deck is adjusted for that. But it's the decks that I know that I'm going to have a problem with. Like, perfect example for me is Blood Moon decks. I just personally can't face them for some reason. Okay, I want to have a Hydroblast for that deck, that sort of thing. I want to have, XYZ cards to bring in against those decks.
So an example of, broadening your sideboard slots to cover a couple of different like a couple of different things, like essentially making it so that your sideboard cards can go farther for you. Let me just touch on an example of like breaking down what a deck in current day looked like from how many different axes it has. And if you look at, for example, you're on Breakfast, right? So Breakfast. So let's talk about Breakfast with Nadu and Breakfast after Nadu, right? And why I think it is still a very good deck. Because if you boiled it down to how many axes it has to compete on, there's so many that it becomes really hard to pilot against, because which axis are you supposed to fight on, especially if they're all proactive axes. So when Nadu was around, you had Cephalid Illusionist plus the pairing, whether that's Nomads or Shuko. You had Nadu plus the pairing, Shukos plus Nomad, right? So that's 2 axes already. One kills you, one ostensibly kills you. You had Urza Saga by itself, that's an axis. And you had Tamiyo by itself, that's an axis. So this is a deck with 4 axes.
4 axes, yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, if you spend your time fighting over the Tamiyo axis, will you have enough resources to fight over a follow-up? And if it ever feels like you're playing against a deck and it's like, man, they always have it. Like, how do they always have the thing? Like, if Reanimator always has it, like if it feels like they always have it, you could probably look back at those games that you played where they ostensibly always had it, and it was really what they did was they had such a density of different axes to compete on that all like effectively get them into a position to win the game, that it feels as though they never ran out of gas or ran out of something to do that was game ending threatening, because each of those axes, they had so many different axes that they could work with. And Tamiyo in particular is so powerful in all these decks because it's a single card axis that you have to respect. And so because you have to allocate resources to this one axis, 4 slots in their deck on one card gives them a whole new axis that you have to fight against. And same thing vice versa. If you put a Tamiyo into play, that's an axis that they have to compete against. And then same thing for the One Ring Karn decks. It's like, okay, you have Karn by itself. That's an axis, right? Because it solves all of your problems on its own. One Ring, that solves all of it on its own. And then those decks also have Urza Saga. That's 3 axes. If they want to throw in anything else, like Mystic Forge by itself is like the reason that it always feels like that card just slams until slams, and you have to have an answer for every single one is because each one individually is an axis.
Yeah, now, and they need more than just like one card to answer a lot of times too.
Right, but the trick with each one as to like why some feel more powerful than others is because the requirements to make any of them work, like Karn on turn 4 is really good with whatever it gets on suspend, right? Like if you're like, oh man, if it goes after my mana with Liquid Metal Coating, that's gonna be really bad. But Liquid Metal Coating is picked out on their turn 2 when they've cast it, and now it's a turn 3 play, but you can fight over it on the stack, you can do a thing. Like now they're up a card that's bad, and then they still have the Karn that's going to accrue them more value. But like the threat of that thing is on suspend for a turn, unless it's Tormod's Crypt. But with Mystic Forge is at the mercy of the top of the deck, right? So like, yes, it could just bury you, but there are also times where it's just going to hit land and not do anything. So there's a bunch of variance, even though it is an axis that you have to care about. The One Ring doesn't care, right? The One Ring is going to do whatever it does, irrelevant of what other cards are around it. So that makes it like a more impactful, like, oh, this is a game-ending thing immediately, because it doesn't need time or additional constraints around it to make it a thing. So the reason that I think Breakfast is still very good, even though they lost Nadu, is they're still now in those Nadu slots. People can go back to being more combo-oriented to like reinforce one of the other 3 axes that it currently has, right? Like you can add more things to embolden the Urza Saga side of things, whether that's putting a Pithing Needle or a Shadow Spear or something in your deck that like makes the Urza Saga axis better by itself. You could do more things that help the the Cephalid Breakfast combo part of it, like putting in the Cabal Therapy, right? Like if you're looking at combo, the Cabal Therapy is going to further that along. But you're spending a slot on that where Nadu would have been. If you're going on Tamiyo is by itself, it's just a 1-card thing. You don't need anything else to improve upon that. But if you were looking at like people going back to like thinking about Stoneforge Mystic would be another axis. Now, potency of how powerful that axis in a metagame is dependent, right? Like it's nowhere near as powerful as what Nadu was. But let's say people were like, okay, I'm going to put in a Cabal Therapy to improve the thing, 3 Stoneforge Mystics and a Cauldron Complete. Well, Cauldron Complete only works with the axis that Stoneforge Mystic is working with, right? Otherwise, it has no text with the other stuff.
Well, it does have text with core Nomad.
It is
actually, because you can redirect all the damage.
There is some amount of like synergy to an extent, but like when you're putting Stoneforge Mystic into your deck with a Cauldron, you know that like, okay, that's a whole nother axis that now the deck has that their opponent is going to have to respect. And as a result, you still have 4 axes, even if one of them is not nearly as powerful as what Nadu was.
Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel.
And then, so like, when you're playing against something like more linear decks, like Corey Steel Cutter, like the reason that Reanimator last season with Entomb Reanimate is so good, and people are saying, well, how do you know what to fight against? It's like, well, if they have Daze Wasteland plus Threat, or Entomb Reanimate, or they can just Barrow Goyf by itself and like think that like, okay, Barrow Goyf as a pivot. And like there are all these pivots and you need all these different cards because the answers can't keep up with all these different axes that you're competing on. But then it's like, okay, well, if you put Grafdigger's Cage into play, it limits the Entomb Reanimate side of the package. But, you know, Entomb still like brought together, like Tamiyo can pick up something. So it's effectively a demonic tutor. Barrow Goyf plus, you know, additional sideboard threats of like whatever they might be playing is a whole nother axis because Barrow Goyf is also a card advantage engine by itself. So thinking about, rather than going, okay, how do I beat this deck? Try and boil the stuff down to the axes that they're competing on. If you're thinking, okay, this is my way of like contending with the Tamiyo axis, theoretically, that would mean that whatever card you're using to beat the Tamiyo axis is the way that you would try and beat Tamiyo with all of the other decks. So then when you're sideboard mapping, you're like, this is not to solve this matchup or going into this deck. This is to solve this axis. And Tamiyo is an axis that every single blue deck has now. And so even if those cards don't have ways to compete with the rest of the deck, presumably it's solving the Tamiyo. And then if you pick all the cards that you have available to solve one axis, and then you're like, okay, which one has the most crossover against the rest of the field that I anticipate running into? I expect a lot of Urza Saga. So I'm looking at things like Engineered Explosives. Now, Engineered Explosives is not going to help me with the Show and Tell Tamiyos. It's not going to help me with the Reanimator Tamiyos. But it does have more crossover against the expected field. Now, something for what you were talking about Blood Moon, where you're like, okay, I want the Hydroblasts. But if you're like, okay, well, I need crossover, and I'm still concerned about like the Barrow Goyfs of the world or the Kaitos of the world, then it's like, okay, looking at something like Celestial Purge, which, you know, you concede being worse against like, you know, Price of Progress if you get rid of your Hydroblasts, but you can still remove the Bombardiers and the Blood Moons. But now you also have a way to combat against the Kaitos and the Barrow Goyfs of the world. And that it's one shift. Of course, it's a different card, it's different colors, but like it's the thought process behind them of like, how do you pick and choose your stuff to fight over an axis rather than I need to beat Blood Moon, therefore I need Hydroblast. And it's like, well, take it one step further, broaden it out, and then you might be able to like see other cards as like highlighted in a way that they weren't before.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about a better philosophy on sideboarding. I kind of wonder, you know, I wonder, one, does anybody have any ideas as far as what they do? Does anybody do anything differently than us, right? What's that?
The idea that I had going into these days, so looking at how, like in these early couple of weeks before EW, there used to be a time where Doomsday is now taking on, like, I'm seeing a bunch of Doomsday decks do well. And what they've been doing is they've essentially been using the sideboard pivot plan into what was Dimir Tempo, right? Like they've sort of acquired,
or they started Dimir Tempo or Dimir Reanimator, and then they go to that.
They're sort of picking and choosing which way they want to go with it. By doing that, though, they are less redundant because they're picking up more axes, right? Like by becoming having more variety in their axes, right? They're like saying, okay, we're going to have Kaito and Tamiyo and Doomsday and Barrow Goyf, and we're going to have all these different pieces. What it means, though, then, is there are different cards that then can rise in value if that's the trajectory of where we're going. So an example of a card that I've been looking at, which we've talked about before, and, you know, I think I'm the only one who's like actually sleeved it up in modern times, but I continuously look at this extract that I have in my grab pile. What I was using it before was there was only one Atraxa in Reanimator. So if I extracted the Atraxa, it was no longer an axis that game could compete on. So I didn't have to worry about that thing fighting over that thing. But you could also do it against Thassa's Oracle in the...
It's tough, though, because if you do it against Thassa's Oracle, one thing you have to realize is that a lot of these Doomsday decks do play too.
So the Doomsday decks were playing too. But then looking at recent lists where they're playing these other axes, they've shaved down to one, because they want to be able to support the axis of Tamiyo and the axis of going into Kaito and Bowmaster and whatever post-board. That if that happens, if decks start shaving the redundancy of an axis to make it more, what's the word?
Potent?
Fragile to particular cards, right? Like if you only play one Thassa's Oracle, but then I'm looking, I can cover with one card all of these Thassa's Oracle decks. If all the Thassa's Oracle decks, like if it is just common knowledge that this metagame is moving towards every deck that would play Thassa's Oracle is only playing one, whether it's Breakfast, whether it's Oops All Spells, or whether it's Doomsday. Like they're all Thassa's Oracle decks, but if they're all only playing one, then this one card in my deck has, or in my sideboard, has a lot of power against that axis, against all these different decks. So if one card can solve an entire axis for me across a bunch of different decks that I anticipate being in the field, that's pretty potent. Even though that card seems on its face pretty underpowered. But like looking at it through that lens of like, this is the plan for this card, and I expect the metagame to be single Thassa's Oracle decks rather than what Doomsday was of two Thassa's Oracle, because they want to be able to like compete against the rest of the field themselves doing all this stuff. But like the fact that it's if you open on Extract, if lights out if you're not on the draw against Oops, and then it's good against Breakfast in that like if they don't have the Nadu package anymore, if you only have to contend with Urza Saga and Stoneforge Mystic, it gets a lot easier if you don't have to fear getting comboed out of nowhere.
It's also if you don't care about the Thassa's Oracle part of the plan, like hitting a Kadra,
right? Yeah, that's what I mean.
Isn't the worst either, right?
You can hit something else that they have going on,
yeah.
And so in a world where the axes are going to start to shift a little bit because Nadu is now not just like Nadu and Entomb are not just things that decks can slot in as whole axes into their thing. You've said it a billion times on this podcast where you're like, yep, Reanimator was just 10 cards, right? That was a 10-card axis that any deck that was playing blue and black could
maybe 11.
Black, that any deck that was playing black could just, incorporate into their list. And then we saw a bunch of players. I remember talking about how Mark Vogt was just like taking the Nadu package and like putting it into all these different decks, and how it was just like, yep, you just take some Urza Saga and some Nadus in Nomad's Encore or Shuko, and now you have a 10-card package that can go into literally any deck, and it will draw you your deck every time. And that's a whole axis that people have to respect, otherwise it wins the game. And with that gone, with both of those 10-card, maybe 11 cards for Nadu, but like with both of those packages gone, the world has opened up for like what might be possible for cards that can combat the now a little bit more limited axes that the format is now lame ducked upon.
I think a lot of people have asked in comments and stuff like why now for Nadu and why now for Entomb, and I think what you just said is the perfect reason. If we look back on these bands and see a theme, it's going to be the concept of like being able to take a deck and smash it together real fast and throw it into another deck.
Yeah, it's tricky in that like it's tough to see, even though people have been calling for One Ring and Tamiyo bans. It's tough to like, you can look at it. Well, it's like it's Entomb plus Reanimate as the package plus the fatties, right? It's Nadu plus the combo, and then it doesn't matter on the other side. But it's like it's these cards as packages, and like you play against these packages, and then they become a different decks. But like if you're playing against a Nadu deck, you're playing like it's called Nadu. If you're playing against Reanimator, it's Entomb Reanimate. Like it is, they have the optics of being whole strategies, whereas like Forge is not called One Ring. Every blue deck is not called Tamiyo. Like the optics of these individual cards don't have the same heat as ones that are whole strategies. But like you could call any of the, you could call it, Saga One Ring deck.
Sure.
You could call it,
you could.
Tamiyo plus whatever, like, and because those are the axes that those decks have that they're using to actually win the game. That's what those decks do.
It's funny because I'll end this here. It's funny because the new wave of how we name decks, like, Cephalid Breakfast, right? We don't name decks Cephalid Breakfast anymore. We don't name things Tricks anymore. It's Color Pie, Name, right? Jeskai, Dimir, Boros, 4-color, whatever, that, and then what the deck is doing. So it's like you're playing Jeskai Wizards. You're playing Dimir Reanimator, right? You get that limits you to like, you can't be like Dimir Reanimator with Tamiyo, and like that is a feature of the old style, because you could get away with like Cephalid Breakfast was a whole vibe of words that explained the whole thing, and people would be like, no one would ever be like, you need to ban Cephalid Illusionist. They'd be like, there are cards in here that you have to deal with, right?
But if you looked at what Dimir Reanimator was and what Dimir Tempo was / still is, even though it's Dimir Reanimator, which is that package of the Reanimator cards, and Dimir Tempo, it's like, okay, well, it's 4 Entomb, 4 Reanimate, and 2 Fatties, or it's 4 Nethergoyf, 2 Kaito, X number of Bowmasters, Flex.
Yeah.
Right? But otherwise, those decks are identical, right? It's still Days Wasteland, Force, Ponder, Brainstorm, Tamiyo. Like, those decks are, like, even though they share the metagame, but, like, the experience of when you sit down and play against them across, like, a long tournament, you're still going to experience the Days Wasteland experience. You're still experiencing the Tamiyo experience. Like, these are the axes that these decks compete on. So, like, even though they are different decks, yes, you're going to run into the axes that wins the game a bunch of the time, but when you're playing against the other axes, it's going to feel like redundant and like we want to change. We want something to be different. And it's because Tamiyo by itself is an axis, Days Wasteland by itself, like those cards together as like a whole strat, picking up, like scaffolding anything else. Urza Saga as a package, as an individual card, or One Ring as an individual card. Like, these are things that generate the same experience because they themselves alone are axes. Like, anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Well, hey, what do you guys think? Do you have packages that you use for your sideboard?
Yeah, tell us
are you more of
packages.
Are you more of I just play the stock list and run from there? List them in the comments. Join us on Patreon at patreon.com/EternalDurdle for ad-free content. If you've been getting fed so many ads, and you're so upset about ads, you can pay $5 a month and get all this ad-free.
Yeah, you can. $5 is the sideboard strat against the ads.
It does solve that package. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll catch you in the next one. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/EternalDurdles. Thanks so much for watching.